There's something uniquely unsettling about receiving a letter you weren't expecting, especially when it comes from the government. Not because people necessarily believe something terrible has happened, but because official letters carry a certain weight, a certain silence around them. You see the envelope on the kitchen table, maybe with the WPA logo sitting there in the corner, and suddenly the atmosphere changes slightly. The room feels different. You're mourning. Tea goes cold, and for thousands of pensioners across the UK recently, that's exactly what happened. Unexpected letters arriving through the door from the Department for Work and Pensions. And what's interesting is, the letters themselves weren't necessarily dramatic. In many cases, they were administrative, reviews, assessments, requests for updated information, clarifications around benefits, pension credit, attendance allowance. Some people were told they may have been underpaid, others feared they may have been overpaid, some simply didn't understand why they were being contacted at all. But I think the emotional response tells us something much bigger than the letters themselves, because for a growing number of older people in Britain, interactions with the state no longer feel reassuring, they feel destabilizing, and maybe that's the point people are quietly circling around now, not the paperwork, the feeling underneath it. The thing people are starting to notice is that aging in Britain increasingly comes with a low-level sense of administrative anxiety, not catastrophe necessarily, just uncertainty, a sense that systems are becoming harder to navigate precisely at the stage of life when people need stability the most. You can almost feel the exhaustion. In some of the stories emerging, people in their 70s and 80s sitting on hold for hours, adult children trying to decode bureaucratic language on behalf of their parents, pensioners terrified of making mistakes on forms because they've heard stories about repayments, investigations, benefit suspensions. And it's strange because this generation spent most of their lives being told that the system was there for them: work hard, pay taxes, contribute, and eventually there would be a degree of security, not luxury, not abundance, but stability. That was the social contract, really. And now there's this growing feeling that the contract has become increasingly conditional. You see it in the way people talk about pensions now, not with certainty but with caution, almost suspicion, as though support itself has become fragile, temporary, subject to revision at any moment. And honestly, I keep coming back to the emotional texture of these stories more than the technical details. Because yes, there are practical questions here, important ones, questions about underpayments, about errors, about eligibility reviews, about whether the WPA is trying to modernize systems or recover money or improve accuracy. But underneath all of that is a quieter question: why are so many older people feeling frightened by ordinary administrative contact? That's the part worth sitting with. Because fear doesn't appear in a vacuum, it builds slowly over years, sometimes decades, and I think what we're witnessing is the cumulative effect of a country where institutions have gradually become less human in the eyes of the public. Banks close local branches, GP surgeries move online, councils become harder to contact, customer service becomes automated, and then eventually even welfare systems start to feel distant and procedural rather than personal. For younger people, frustrating bureaucracy is often treated as an annoyance, but for many elderly people, it can feel existential. One confusing letter can alter an entire week emotionally. One missed call can create panic. One phrase review of your claim can trigger sleepless nights. Because when you're older, financial disruption carries a different psychological weight. There's less room for recovery, less flexibility, less confidence that problems can simply be solved later, and Britain is aging. That's another part of this conversation that feels unavoidable now. The country is getting older while simultaneously becoming more digitally complex. Services are increasingly designed around online literacy, speed, account access, verification codes, passwords, portals, and although many pensioners adapt remarkably well, many others feel left behind by systems that seem to evolve faster every year. The result is this strange contradiction. We celebrate older generations rhetorically. Politicians constantly talk about protecting pensioners, respecting pensioners, supporting pensioners, and yet many older people describe daily life as increasingly difficult to navigate, not dramatically difficult, just relentlessly complicated. The forms are longer, the rules change, the phone lines are crowded, the language feels technical, the reassurance feels absent, and perhaps younger viewers won't fully understand this yet, but there's something deeply vulnerable about reaching an age where your independence depends partly on systems you no longer fully trust. That vulnerability changes people. You can hear it in the voices of pensioners being interviewed recently. Not anger exactly, more like fatigue, a tiredness that comes from constantly having to prove things, confirm things, reconfirm things, and I think there's also a generational dignity at play here. Many older Britons were raised not to complain, not to ask for help unless absolutely necessary. They lived through rationing, austerity, economic downturns, industrial decline. They adapted quietly. So when those same people begin expressing anxiety publicly, it usually means something deeper is happening underneath. There's this growing sense that old age in Britain is becoming more administratively demanding at the exact moment life should perhaps become simpler, and of course defenders of the system will argue not entirely unfairly that reviews and assessments are necessary. Governments have responsibilities, public money has to be tracked, errors need correcting, fraud exists, systems require updating, and they're right. No welfare system can function purely on trust alone. The WPA itself would likely argue these letters are part of maintaining accuracy and fairness, that some pensioners are owed money while others may need records updated, that communication is unavoidable in a system supporting millions of people, and objectively that's true, but politics is rarely only about objective truth, it's also about emotional experience. How people feel while moving through systems matters, whether citizens feel respected matters, whether elderly people feel secure matters, and I think that's where this issue becomes politically significant beyond the headlines, because trust in institutions isn't usually destroyed by one enormous scandal alone. It erodes gradually. A delayed payment here, an unanswered phone call there, a confusing form, a humiliating assessment, a sense of being processed rather than understood, and eventually people stop experiencing the state as supportive infrastructure. They experience it as pressure. That shift changes societies in subtle ways. You start seeing more intergenerational anxiety, families stepping in to interpret official language, adult children managing finances for aging parents earlier than expected, communities becoming informal translators for bureaucratic systems, and maybe some people would say that's simply modern life. Maybe large countries inevitably become procedural. Maybe nostalgia for a more personal welfare state ignores the reality that the old systems had flaws too, but still. The emotional atmosphere feels different now, colder somehow, more transactional. The conversation seems to be shifting toward a broader question about what citizenship actually feels like in modern Britain, not theoretically, practically, emotionally. What does it feel like to grow old here? That's the question sitting underneath all this, because retirement was once imagined as a kind of exhale, not perfect, obviously, but calmer, more settled, a stage of life where people could finally stop navigating constant economic uncertainty. Instead, many pensioners now describe a life still dominated by calculations. Energy bills, housing costs, care costs, food prices, benefit eligibility, digital access, and now unexpected government letters. You can almost sense the psychological accumulation of it all, and there's another layer to this story that people are beginning to discuss more openly: loneliness, because administrative stress becomes far more frightening when experienced alone. A confusing letter is one thing if you have immediate support around you, a partner to discuss it with, children nearby, friends who can help interpret things, but millions of elderly people live alone, and in isolation, uncertainty expands. A small issue can begin to feel enormous. That's partly why these stories resonate so widely. They tap into a broader cultural fear about aging itself, not simply the fear of getting older physically, but the fear of becoming vulnerable inside systems that move too quickly, and honestly, I don't think Britain has fully confronted that reality yet. Politically, older voters remain influential. Parties court them constantly. Pension protections become election talking points almost every cycle, but emotionally, socially, culturally, there's often far less attention given to what everyday aging actually feels like: the paperwork, the confusion, the waiting, the small humiliations, the dependency, the fear of burdening others. These are quieter experiences, less visible, but they shape daily life profoundly, and I think younger generations are watching all this carefully too, because these stories aren't only about current pensioners, they're also about the future everyone imagines for themselves. People in their 30s, 40s, 50s look at these situations and wonder privately, will this be us eventually? Will retirement feel secure by the time we arrive there? Will the state still function in recognizable ways? Will support systems become more compassionate or more conditional? That uncertainty changes public psychology, particularly in a country already dealing with housing insecurity, strained public services, stagnant wages, and widening distrust in political leadership. The WPA letters become symbolic partly because they arrive inside an atmosphere already saturated with anxiety, and symbols matter politically. A letter is never just a letter, not anymore. It becomes a reflection of whether people feel seen or processed, valued or managed, protected or scrutinized. And maybe that sounds overly philosophical to some people, but public mood is often built from precisely these ordinary interactions, not grand speeches, not parliamentary debates, daily experiences, the tone of an email, the wait on a phone line, the wording of a form, the fear created by official silence. That's where trust either survives or slowly disappears. And I think what makes this moment especially sensitive is that Britain already feels emotionally exhausted in many ways. The past decade has carried wave after wave of instability: Brexit, political turbulence, the pandemic, the cost of living crisis, public service pressures, economic stagnation. People have adapted repeatedly, but adaptation has emotional consequences. There's this growing fragility underneath public life now, a sense that many people are only just coping administratively, financially, psychologically. So when thousands of pensioners suddenly receive unexpected DWP letters, the reaction isn't simply about paperwork. It connects into a much larger emotional landscape, one where people increasingly fear systems becoming harder, harsher, less forgiving. And to be fair, there are also people who believe some of this anxiety is amplified unnecessarily. Some commentators argue media coverage itself can create panic, that routine reviews become framed as threats, that social media spreads worst-case interpretations before facts are fully understood. That perspective deserves consideration too, because fear can spread quickly now, particularly among communities already feeling uncertain, and not every letter represents danger. Not every review leads to cuts. Not every administrative process is hostile, but perception matters because perception shapes behavior. If elderly citizens increasingly associate official contact with fear, then something significant has shifted regardless of the technical intentions behind the letters. And honestly, I suspect this story will linger precisely because it touches something deeper than politics. It touches dignity, how societies treat aging populations. Says a great deal about their moral priorities. Not rhetorically, practically. Do older people feel calm? Do they feel respected? Do they feel safe navigating public systems? Do they feel listened to when confused? Or do they feel like administrative problems waiting to be processed? That distinction matters more than governments sometimes realize, because trust, once weakened, is difficult to rebuild. And perhaps this is where the broader political conversation starts heading next. Away from pure economics and toward emotional governance, not simply whether systems function mathematically, but whether they feel humane, whether citizens experience dignity while interacting with institutions, whether efficiency has quietly replaced empathy, and maybe that's the point people are circling around without fully articulating it yet. The fear surrounding these letters isn't really about envelopes. It's about the growing suspicion that modern life is becoming emotionally unmanageable for ordinary people. Too many passwords, too many forms, too many conditions, too much uncertainty, especially for those who believed they had already done their part. There's something quietly heartbreaking about reaching old age only to feel permanently administrated, permanently assessed, permanently required to prove your circumstances again and again. And maybe future governments, regardless of party, will need to understand this more deeply, because aging populations are not simply economic categories, they are emotional communities. Communities carrying memory, expectation, sacrifice, fear, resilience, and the relationship between those communities and the state will shape British politics for years to come, not through dramatic revolutions, but through atmosphere, trust, tone, the feeling citizens carry when they open a letter at the kitchen table. I keep thinking about that image actually. An elderly person standing quietly in their home, envelope in hand, trying to interpret what the state is asking from them now. And in that moment, the issue stops being abstract, it becomes deeply human, because beyond all the policy language and administrative explanations, people are really asking something very simple. Can I still feel secure here? Can I grow old without constantly fearing disruption? Can the systems around me feel understandable, manageable, compassionate? And if increasing numbers of people no longer feel confident answering yes to those questions, then this story is about far more than unexpected letters from the WPA. It's about the emotional condition of modern Britain itself. And honestly, I think people are beginning to feel that more and more,